This activity, we're going to focus on how to use databases, and we're going to use a database in Google Docs, namely Google Sheets, which has both spreadsheet and database capabilities. When we talk about atherosclerosis, atherosclerosis, commonly known as hardening of the arteries, it's a very serious health concern here in the United States and around the world. In fact, heart disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States. And when the arteries get hard or plaque develops on them, it becomes more difficult for blood to flow through, and that can cause strokes in the brain, could cause phlebitis in the limbs, could cause a heart attack if occurring in a coronary artery. And so you can see by this diagram right here that a histologically normal person has a large lumen, and the blood cells and so forth can flow freely through this. But when you have lipid accumulation on the inside of the lumen, then it starts to occlude the space that the blood can flow. And if this is allowed to grow, you can have kind of a total occlusion. And so what we're going to work on here is trying to look at a database of foods and determine which foods are perhaps the most dangerous foods in the sense of building up plaque and so forth, and causing atherosclerosis and subsequently some of those conditions we mentioned. So if you're on an anti-atherosclerosis diet, there's a number of foods to avoid. One is saturated fats. These typically are animal-based fats and so forth. You'd find like in meats and butter and so forth. Trans fats are fats that are used to basically, when we hydrogenate fats and so forth, to stabilize them. In a lot of processed foods, like you can see with the donuts and so forth, there tend to have a stability in terms of not running and so forth on the surface, but they can cause quite a bit of problem in terms of building up plaque on the inside of the arteries. Cholesterol-rich foods, there's not as much of a concern about cholesterol as there used to be. But still there is a number of people that warn against high cholesterol diets. And then refined carbohydrates, basically starches and simple sugars and so forth. And salt, sodium chloride, of course a necessary substance for the body, but it does increase the blood pressure by retaining water in the bloodstream. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a database, and the database is on the website. It's called Nutrition here. And what we have here is we have foods on the left, and we have the various different components of those foods listed across here. So when we look at a row, that is called a record, and we look at a column, that's called a field. And so if we're looking at let's say we were looking at the record for beets, and we wanted to know what the energy kcals per serving was, in other words, what we generally refer to as calories, we could look at that intersection of that record and that field, and we could see that the answer right there is 26 kcals per serving size. Well, in this particular activity, what we are intending to do is to select those foods that might be considerable concern in terms of basically stimulating atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries. So if you look across the top here, you'll see the various different components and so forth. And this one over here is saturated fats. You may not be able to read that there, but we can change that by going over here and looking at the word wrapping, and now you can see the components there. So if you can't see the components in a cell, you can change the word wrapping feature. If things are too small and so forth, we can increase the size. Command plus or Control plus on the PC will increase the size of all the elements on a web page, and Control minus would do just the reverse, or Command minus on the Macintosh. And when we are examining this, you may notice these thick bars right here below number 1 and right vertically here to the right of A. These are how we can freeze various different rows and columns. Notice if I scroll here, the headers in blue remain constant. And if I scroll to the right, that the record titles in yellow remain constant. The way that that's established is if you go to View, you can say Freeze. I'm going to unfreeze the rows, and I'm going to unfreeze the columns. And now when we go to sort these and so forth, if I was to go to sort these right here, sorting A to Z, you can see here that now our header disappeared. It actually happens to be down here under C. If we get down there somewhere, we're going to see the there it is right there. It was referenced near the bottom. And so we can Command Z or Control C to undo that. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on number 1 and we're going to view and freeze the rows. Similarly, we're going to click on A and we're going to view and we're going to freeze the columns. So the rows and the columns are now frozen, so now we can scroll to the right and we can scroll to the bottom, and we don't lose our headers. Now this table might be a little confusing because you see these little triangles here. This was actually imported from Excel, and Excel is, of course, a Microsoft product, and it's a spreadsheet and also has database features on it. Those create are listing features to allow you to sort by lists, but the icons imported here, we should actually be looking at the ones up here in the field headers here, like under B, C. You can see, again, if we zoom in there, you can see those little triangles. Those are the triangles we're going to use when we want to do some kind of a sort on a particular category. So let's say we wanted to sort on cholesterol. Again, cholesterol's here. I'll just widen the column by taking the cursor and just dragging it across here. Let me enlarge this a little bit so it's a little easier to see what's going on. And if I wanted to sort this, I would click under B, under the field header, and I would say I'd like to sort from Z to A, and that means from high to low. And we can see that of all the foods in this particular database, beef liver has the largest amount of cholesterol per serving size. Now, we could also look at other features. Again, things which we had mentioned may contribute to atherosclerosis. And those things would be the sodium content, sodium being the cation in sodium chloride, and the saturated fat content. Trans fats and so forth would be helpful as well. But I'm going to, this database does not have that. So I'm just going to go over here and I'd say, let's take a look at the saturated fats. And if I want to move that column, I can click on column L and I can drag this across over here and position it next to cholesterol. So now I've juxtaposed the saturated fats field with the cholesterol field. I'm going to do the same thing with moving over the sodium one, but this time I'm going to do a different way. I'm going to hide some columns. So if I click on columns D through I, for example, I'll just click up on the triangle in the field headquarter and I'll say I'd like to hide those columns. Now, those columns are still there. We can see them there by these little triangles that you see right here. If I click on that, it basically expands and those cells are now visible. But we want to hide them right now. It just means that they're not visible under this particular view. And we can do the same thing if I click on J and then shift-click over on P. Then I've highlighted columns J through P, and I can say I would like to hide those columns as well. And now sodium comes over there right next to saturated fats. Again, these things over here to the right are really not necessary so for this particular analysis, so we can hide them. And those columns are now hidden. And we'll hide one more right here. So we now have, actually one more, okay. So we now have cholesterol, saturated fats, and sodium. And then the food type, just so we can see if there's any kind of correlation between the foods to avoid and a food type. So if cholesterol is something to avoid, and again, there's a lot of debate on this right now in terms of good and bad cholesterol and so forth, but we're just going to say, for the sake of argument here, that we're going to try to avoid anything in the cholesterol which is in the top, let's say, maybe like 40% or so of this database. So if I scroll to the bottom, you can see the database goes all the way to 181. So we're going to, let's say if we did 50%, that would be 90. So let's go down to 90. And we can see here that at 90, cholesterol is 0. So these ones don't even really have any cholesterol to concern ourselves with. So if we're trying to set a criteria of things to avoid, you'll notice it goes from 410 down to about 10 here in the first 60. We're going to say that anything, let's say, above 20. Again, this is rather arbitrary, but we can say here we would like to filter here. And the filter is, we're going to filter by values here. And so we would like to search for ones here that are between two values there. So having determined that 20 is the minimum number that we want to use for the foods to avoid in terms of cholesterol, we can do a conditional format here. We're going to say conditional formatting, and over here is going to be your rules and so forth for the conditional formatting. So in column B, which is cholesterol, we're going to say that if the text, okay, is, or if the value is greater than or equal to 20, we're going to label it in red. Okay, that means that those are foods that we want to be at least somewhat concerned about. If we scroll down, you'll notice that there's the division between 19 and 21. Similarly, if you look at the saturated fats, we're going to sort this column here from high to low, and as we scroll down here, we'll say, again arbitrarily, anything greater than 5 grams per serving size is something we should be concerned with. So we'll add another rule here, and this is now applying to saturated fats column, and we'll say if the value of this is greater than or equal to 5, then we'll label that red as well. Now, if they're both labeled red, then those are foods that to be somewhat concerned about. So, for example, stick butter here is high in both cholesterol and saturated fats. And finally, we're going to do the same thing with the column over here. So we're going to look at sodium, and we're going to sort sodium Z high to low. And again, we're going to look down to about the same place in the table, choosing a value of about 140. And so we'll say anything with a value of 140 or higher should be we should be cautious of. So we'll add a new rule here, and for column Q, which is sodium, we'll say if the value here is greater than or equal to, I think we said 50, then we will also call that red. And now when we look through this, we would look for those foods which matched all the criteria. So we can see here that corn dogs, this column right here, is one that we should be concerned with because it is high both in cholesterol, saturated fats, and sodium. We can see the same thing here on butter, and the same thing here on cottage cheese and on beef burritos. And so that's a way to actually sort using various different selection criteria for a database to see what meets certain criteria. So again, this is kind of just an introduction to how to select various different values in a database that meet various different criteria. These would be ones that we'd probably be concerned with if we were trying to develop an anti-atherosclerosis diet.